Hello everyone, my name is Leah Wolf and I'm an astrologer, and tonight we are going to be talking about Venus retrograde. I would like to explain what is a Venus retrograde, how does it influence people, and how does it impact people. So I am a Western astrologer and I've been studying astrology now for 13 years and been doing readings for 10 years. And Venus retrograde is a very important thing to look at for a person to better understand oneself. So Venus retrograde is not a very common transit for a person to have natally. Approximately 7 to 8% of people have natal Venus retrograde. Venus retrograde can happen in all the signs in the zodiac, but Venus retrograde happens in each sign every 8 years. So how you can better understand Venus retrogrades is understanding the synodic planet cycles and understanding Venus retrograde cycles. Venus goes retrograde in each sign every 8 years, and it happens every year and a half. It's a pretty common transit, but it's not as common as Mercury retrograde. It's not as common as Mercury retrograde. It doesn't happen a couple times a year. It happens less frequently. So that's just a general outline of what the Venus retrograde is, but I'm going to go into more detail about it. So first of all, what I want to explain that, so with Venus retrograde, how does a Venus retrograde work and what does it mean? So the Venus retrograde, as I was saying, happens once every 8 years per sign, and the sign for Venus retrograde is the 5-pointed star. A pentagram is what is affiliated with the Venus retrograde. The best way to really look at a Venus retrograde and really understand the cycle for a beginner is to invest in the American Ephemeris. I don't know if you can see it okay from this angle, but I have right here a 21st century midnight edition Ephemeris and a 21st century one. So this one goes from 2000 to 2050. All the planetary data and years and planet cycles are in here. So if you're studying Venus retrogrades or Mars retrogrades and you want to understand synodic cycles or synodic astrology better, I really recommend getting into Ephemeris and really studying it. And basically on the inside of the Ephemeris you'll see a whole planet table, and here I have highlighted the Venus retrograde so I can track each one. So, and then this book is from 1900 to 2000. And you know, it's really good to have an ephemeris from the 20th century because you may have a client that was born in the 1940s or 50s or 60s, and you may want to do predictive astrology work with them, and this is a very useful tool for understanding planet cycles and to keeping track of it. And yes, it is old school. Some people do it on their computer, but this is great because I can get that data right away. I can just plug it in. I don't have to fiddle around on the computer, and fiddling around on the computer is great too, but this is a great tool for better understanding astrology and to really understand how retrogrades affect you as a person. The best way to really do that would be to think about the most important events that have happened in your life. Make a list. Venus retrogrades are a planet cycle, and when new cycles happen, changes happen in a person's life. So for one person, a Venus retrograde may really affect them more than another person, or maybe a Mars retrograde really affects someone more than another, and it really depends upon the natal transit that someone has. A Venus retrograde will affect a Venus retrograde native more than it will probably affect a person who doesn't have it, or not necessarily that it affects them more, but in a different way and to a different magnitude. So when a person is a Venus retrograde native, it means that the time they were born, Venus was going retrograde. And so Venus retrograde, what's interesting about it is that when Venus goes retrograde, you can see it in the sky as a larger, bigger planet. So if you're looking up at the stars and Venus is going retrograde, let's just say, for example, like this year, 2017, we had a Venus retrograde that occurred in March of April of 2017, and it was in Aries, and the last couple of days of the retrograde it went into Pisces for a while, but the majority of the Venus retrograde this year was in Aries. So let's just say the moon was in Aries. in March. If you look up at the sky, you're going to see Venus close to that moon because it's conjunct or getting close to conjuncting the moon. And so if you look up at the sky, you will see Venus bigger and brighter during retrograde periods. And the planet is moving slower at this time. So that's how you can really see a Venus retrograde in the sky. You'll notice the planets look different, the stars look different. You'll see it brighter and bigger because it's slower, it's getting closer. So what is a Venus retrograde cycle? That is the question you should ask yourself if you're trying to learn what it is. So a Venus retrograde cycle is when the planet Venus is slowing down in the sky. And when this happens, a faster moving planet, say for example the sun, catches up to the planet and they pass by. So when a faster moving planet catches up and passes a slower moving planet during their orbits around the sun, that is what a retrograde is. These planets, the slower planet is catching up with the faster one and they're going into each other's orbits. And then when you look up at the sky, you can see Venus bigger and brighter. So that is one way I could explain it to people so that they better understand what it means. It's not, when astrologers talk about planets being retrograde, it's not literally that they're going backwards, it's that they're slowing down and crossing the orbit of another planet. It's a term that they use. And some people may literally think, oh, retrograde, it's going backwards. It means that it's slowing down. It means that the planet is slowing down. So a very interesting tool for understanding the retrogrades is to even look in your journal. Look at major life events to see how it affects you and look to see if there's a pattern. For example, look at, you could look at major life events such as a marriage, a divorce, major emotional shifts, a surgery, a diagnosis, an accident, the purchase of a new home, selling a home, starting a new career, just big life events like that. Just think about your life, look back on the most intense times or times where there are big changes, take note of those dates, look in your journal, write them down, check your transits, and if you aren't an astrologer, that's okay. There's really easy ways that you can look into this, and the easiest way to do it is to just look in the ephemeris. You open up to the dates, so you'd say, okay, what was going on with me in October of 2010? And you look there and you see, oh, there was a Venus retrograde in Scorpio. So that's one way to look at it. And I think another tool for better understanding the Venus retrograde is to look at famous people who've had this transit, because famous people, their lives are public record. You know more, you're going to know more about their life because it's exposed, because they're a public figure. And I could tell you some people who have some Venus retrograde that are celebrities. For example, Amy Winehouse has Venus retrograde in Leo. Charlize Theron, she has Venus retrograde in Virgo. Charlie Chaplin has Venus retrograde. Eric Clapton has Venus retrograde. Jodie Foster also has Venus retrograde in Scorpio. Kate Middleton, Ellen DeGeneres, Gabby Hoffman, Ted Bundy, the serial killer, had Venus retrograde. All sorts of different people that are famous in our culture have had it. So Venus retrogrades are basically a period that mark the time when a new cycle starts. And that can be one reason why many people experience a lot of changes during the Venus retrograde. So my advice for better understanding the Venus retrograde and how it affects you on that personal level, again, is to make that list. Look in your journal. Look for the patterns. For example, I had one client who continuously was getting in all these different car accidents. She had like 7 or 8 car accidents throughout a few decades, and she wanted to know why she kept getting in these car accidents. So I talked to her and I asked her, make a list of these accidents, and we're going to look up and see if there is a planet cycle that keeps happening or a transit that keeps repeating itself. So lo and behold, we look at it, and every time she got in an accident, it was during a Venus retrograde cycle, and it was aspecting her Mars every time. It was particular Venus retrograde cycles for this particular person. So then we were able to see this as a tool. This Venus retrograde and these transits and these dates were used as tools to help her better understand herself. So then I was able to look in the ephemeris and tell her over the next decade or so when to be careful. When is that transit going to happen again? So maybe when the Venus retrograde in Leo happens again, you should just slow down and be really careful on the road, or maybe drive less, or just do certain things to just be extra cautious. Even just having that knowledge and awareness can help as well. So that's one way you can really help a person with a Venus retrograde cycle. So that's just one tool you could use. You can use SYNODIC astrology in relation to predictive astrology. Predictive astrology is basically when an astrologer looks at a person's transits, they notice patterns, they notice things that are repeated, and they look into the next several years or decades of their life, and they give them very important lists and dates, and they make predictions based on, they go on the ephemeris, or they go on their software, they draft up different charts to see the transits that are happening to the person, and that's how they are able to see what's going on and make predictions. And using Venus retrograde and Mars retrograde cycles can be really it can be a really powerful tool for predictive astrology. Mercury retrograde, on the other hand, that happens so frequently. It's not that Mercury retrograde isn't as impactful, it's just more common. And when a planet is slower moving and there's retrogrades happening less frequently, I feel that the impact can be so much greater and on a deeper, longer lasting level. So the other thing people should be aware of during a Venus retrograde is that it may say, I wrote some notes down. So like, let's just say the Venus retrograde starts March 4th, 2017 in Aries, and it goes direct April 15th, 2017. There is something called a shadow period that happens before and after any planetary retrograde. A shadow period is basically, there's several days before the retrograde and several days after where the influence of the retrograde is still happening. It's not in retrograde anymore, but you can still feel it. You're not totally out of the woods yet for it being over. So many astrologers consider the shadow period as being part of the retrograde, but less intense than the actual period of the retrograde. So like, for example, this year we had the Venus retrograde in Aries, and a small portion of it was in Pisces. So the last time that we had a Venus retrograde in Aries was in spring of 2009, and then the last one before that was 2001, 1993, 1985, and 1977. So what you do is you basically subtract 8 years from 2017. That takes you to 2009, subtract another 8 years from 2009, that takes you to 2001. And that is how you can see when each retrograde repeats itself. So every 8 years, Venus goes retrograde in each sign. But in between them, there are other Venus retrogrades happening, but they're just in different signs. So why and how is Venus retrograde significant for people? Well, one thing you really need to look at is the person's chart. If there's a Venus retrograde in Aries and their sun is in Aries, that means that that Venus retrograde is crossing and aspecting their sun sign, which is their big ruling planet. Or let's just say the Venus retrograde's hitting their moon a few times, or it's opposing their moon. That's another thing to really look at. When Venus retrogrades hit through your 12th and your first house and go over your ascendant, and then when they go over or aspect your descendant, that can be really major. For example, my descendant is in Gemini and my rising is in Sagittarius. So anytime Venus goes retrograde in Gemini, a lot of things happen for me. It brings a lot of issues and changes involving other people because it's aspecting my 7th house. My 7th first house axis. It's bringing in both themes. It's really going to influence my romantic relationships or my relationships with other people or business partnerships, and I've noticed this. And every time Venus goes retrograde in Gemini, I really take note of what happens and I write it down, and I'm aware of what's going on. So now the next Venus retrograde in Gemini is going to be in 2020, and then the next one after that is going to be 2028. So before I keep talking about Venus retrograde, let's just talk about the planet Venus and what it is. So in astrology, there are many planets that are in the charts. I'm not going to get into all the planets right now because that's just going to be a lot of information, and I could talk for hours and hours about this, but we only have so much time. So Venus, people think, oh, it's all about love. Well, it's not necessarily that it's only all about love. Other themes of Venus can be the material world, material possessions, beauty, sensuality. It can be a person's style of how they love, how they're affectionate, how they express love. Can be a big indication of their Venus and how it's aspected in their chart, or what sign it's in. So like what sign a person's Venus is in their natal chart is kind of like it's like their flavor of love. Like, how do they love? Venus is ruled by Taurus and Libra traditionally, and it is technically in rulership terms is the second house, and the second house is ruled by Taurus. Taurus is the material world, it's possessions, it's money, it's finances. So yes, Venus does relate to love and love relationships and how a person loves, but it also has a lot to do with their financial side of life. It could be related to their career, it could be related to their material possessions. And the second house isn't just about money and material. It can also be a person's personal value. It's their value system. The second house can also encompass a person's values. That's very important. The second house is ruled by an earth sign. Its natural ruler is Taurus. It's an earth sign. So Venus does encompass other earthly matters when you're looking at it. The other thing that Venus can indicate in a person's chart is what type of lover are they attracted to? What type of people are they gravitated to? These are generalizations, of course, but typically, maybe a man who has Venus in Cancer likes a very sweet, warm, affectionate woman that gives them a lot of guidance and is very loving and very physically affectionate and kind of soft and feminine. So that's kind of what, maybe that's, whereas a man with Venus and Gemini may really want somebody intellectual that can stimulate their mind and really talk to them and stimulate them with verbal conversation and mental ideas and thoughts and projects. Whereas somebody with Venus in Aquarius, like I have Venus in Aquarius, people that have Venus in Aquarius, they're not usually attracted to people that are cookie cutter, run-of-the-mill kind of people. They like unusual things. They like, maybe they're attracted to kind of quirky, eccentric people or even just somebody who's got unusual interests. Like maybe they're interested in somebody who's into video games or the occult or paranormal investigations, whatever. It could be numerous things. As Aquarius rules the occult. So if you've got Venus in Aquarius, you may really be attracted to somebody who is interested in those things and those themes. So Venus can encompass many different signs. Venus, the planet, is happier in some signs and doesn't do as well in others. I'm not going to get into all the technical terms. We can go on and keep talking. But so Venus, so the sign that somebody's Venus is in is the flavor of. It's a big flavor of their chart. It's something very important to look at. So 7 to 8% of people have natal Venus retrograde. When a person has Venus retrograde, it is not an easy transit to have. That person is going to go through a lot of work in their lifetime. And you can say, oh, Venus retrograde's a bad transit, it's really difficult, but that's a negative way of looking at it. You can look at that transit and you can learn so much from it. It just basically means that that person has a lot of work to do in this lifetime when it comes to self-love and how they relate to others. The biggest challenge that someone with Venus retrograde is going to face, they have to learn how to not self-destruct in relationships with other people. They also have to learn how to love themselves and get value about themselves as a human being, not from a relationship, but they have to draw that self-love and that value within themselves. a lot of people with Venus retrograde, they draw their value and their self-esteem from a relationship versus trying to find it from within. And that is a very difficult thing that they have to learn many times. Like Amy Winehouse, for example, she has Venus retrograde in Leo. The beautiful side of Venus retrograde is that it gives the natives such intense creativity and artistic power. And a lot of people with Venus retrograde, they're some of the most talented musicians you'll ever hear. They're so talented, but they have so many emotions. Their emotions are so intense to the point that they struggle with regulating their feelings. And the dark side of Venus retrograde is being self-destructive. Self-destruction is the dark side of this transit, and drugs and alcohol and, you know, having poor relationship values that really affect them. You know, I mean, there's a lot of cliches in the metaphysical community about Venus retrograde. You know, people think it's all about naughty love and affairs and betrayal and secrets, and yes, Venus retrograde can encompass themes of secrecy or infidelity or underground kind of naughty things, but it's so much more than that. There's so much more to a Venus retrograde than those cliche things that people talk about. Yes, there's a dark side of Venus retrograde. The dark side of Venus retrograde is that it can have a lot to do with betrayal. It can have a lot to do with people experiencing internal pain and ripping through those layers and understanding themselves better. You know, when a planet is retrograde in a person's natal chart, it means this person has to really look inward about these issues and work on that. They have to go inward. You know, just like people always say, oh, it's really bad to have Mercury retrograde in your natal chart. Well, not necessarily. That's one way of looking at it. That's a very one-dimensional way of looking at a retrograde. A retrograde is asking you to look inward, and if you've got it in your natal chart, it's even more intense. And you know, once a person really works through a difficult transit, you can learn so much about yourself and understand life more. So it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's a tool for better understanding yourself, and that's why astrology is so powerful. You know, astrology, it relates to archetypes, it relates to depth psychology, symbolism. There's so many themes. So it disappoints me when I see people generalizing about Venus retrograde being sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's just one facet of it. It goes so much deeper than that. So Venus retrograde can be about violence, domestic violence. It could be explosive rage. People with Venus retrograde a lot of times get into physical fights with their partners, or they have nasty tempers that they can't manage very well. The big issue a lot of people with Venus retrograde have is that they overindulge and they overuse drugs and alcohol a lot of times, or they're self-destructive in relationships, or they have a really hard time self-soothing. It can be untamed emotions, issues regulating feelings. It can be issues that they struggle with when it comes to their self-esteem and their self-worth. Issues with their lovers and relationships with family members. Or if a man has Venus retrograde, it could be a lot of issues that they have with women, relating to women, and relating to themselves with self-love. You know, some people will say, oh, men with Venus retrograde, you know, they like bad girls and they're misogynistic. That's a generalization. You can't say that about every person that has Venus retrograde. Those are just cliches that people run across, but those are some themes that can come up. Not everybody has those issues, but those are just some of the things. But the biggest issue of Venus retrograde is learning to not only find value from relationships, you need to find your sense of value and your self-worth within yourself. The other dark side of Venus retrograde can be, you know, sex work, the sex industry, exploitation of women. A lot of people with Venus retrograde, I'm sad to say, I've seen this with so many people I've done readings for and charts I've looked at. A lot of people that have Venus retrograde, they struggle with domestic violence or having abusive relationships where they were beaten or hit, or a lot of people who've been raped, a lot of women who've been raped have Venus retrograde in their chart. It's very common for people who've been through really horrific trauma to have Venus retrograde, or they attract it with that transit. You know, that energy is so intense, you know, and until a person that has Venus retrograde learns to work with that energy in a healthy way, it can really consume them in a negative way and bring them down. I'm not trying to be negative by saying that, but I think that if you use that transit as a powerful tool and you channel that transit and that energy into something constructive, it can be amazing. You know, Venus retrograde gives people this immense creativity and this immense passion, and there's a great side of Venus retrograde too. It's the creativity, it's the passion, it's that emotional power. Instead of having a nasty temper, channel it into creating something, channel it into making something of yourself. It doesn't have to be negative. And, you know, or if somebody's got Venus retrograde and they don't have explosive feelings, maybe they're swallowing their feelings too much, and it's affecting their health. You know, there's a dark and a light side to any transit, but if you look at your chart and you see how your Venus is being aspected and what other planets are involved in the aspect, that can give you a clue as to how the transit manifests in your chart. And like I said before, every Venus retrograde affects a person differently. It depends upon the placements in their chart, their ascendant, their descendant, their moon. Is it crossing their ruling planets? Is it opposing something? You know, so there's different transits that you look at. There's oppositions, which tend to be struggles involving another person or another outer force outside of yourself. There are squares, and those can be internal struggles and challenges that you have to get through in your life. Then there's trines. Those are generally very positive aspects. It's a 120-degree trine in a person's chart. A trine is like a blessing and a gift that comes to you easily. And then there's conjunctions, and conjunctions are when planets are within or with each other, and they're on each other. And conjunctions are very powerful. It's a lot of energy, and it can either be used constructively or destructively. So Venus retrograde, I want to talk more about it. So some of the archetypes that are associated with Venus retrograde could be the rebel woman, the fallen woman, a female that's a crusader for women's issues. For example, I can't think of her name, but everybody more or less knows who this is. There was a young girl in the Middle East who, in a Muslim country where women were not allowed to go to school, and she was shot in the head because she insisted on going to school. And what happened was she survived that as a child, and now she is a real speaker about education issues and women's rights, and she was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. So my point being is that Venus retrograde archetypes can be influenced by culture. One Venus retrograde archetype in Western culture may be completely different in another culture. Venus retrograde archetypes and themes transcend over various cultures and their influence. So that's something, the cultural impact can really affect the Venus retrograde archetypes. So that's just one example. So, you know, you can't think generally like, oh, Venus retrograde is just a fallen woman or a sex worker. It can be so much more than that. It could be a person who's a feminist. It could be a person who's on a crusade for different human rights issues. It could be a social justice warrior kind of person. You know, maybe that retrograde influenced them to go against the values of their society. So Venus retrograde, in other words, because like I was saying, Taurus in the second house is not just material possessions. It is a person's values. So if somebody's got Venus retrograde, they're going to go against their cultural values. They're going to go against what people are telling them to do. That's why a lot of people with Venus retrograde, they're rebels. They shake things up, they change things. Whether it's through making music and art that changes the world and changes the collective unconscious on that level, or whether they're like a human rights activist, or whether they change the world by enduring something like that young lady did when she was shot. She used that experience and turned it into something constructive and changed the world, in a sense. She influenced people in her country to stand up against women being forbidden education. That's just one example I could get into. Another person who has Venus retrograde is the famous actress Charlize Theron. So I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but you know, Charlize was born, I think, in 1975, and she has Venus retrograde in Virgo. When she was 15 years old, her father, you know, was an alcoholic and a very violent drunk, and he was attacking her mother, and she had to shoot him in self-defense to save her mother's life. And you know, she had a lot of trauma as a young woman, and in her chart, Charlize has natal Venus retrograde squaring Neptune in the 3rd house of early childhood. And so she's got a Venus retrograde squared Neptune retrograde. So both planets are in retrograde and they're squaring each other in the 1st and 3rd house. And there's a 2-degree orb between the two planets that are in square. And she also has a T-square with Chiron, Jupiter. Well, she's got a Saturn T-square with Chiron, Jupiter, and Uranus. And Saturn is the apex of the T-square. So basically, in a chart, when somebody has a T-square, that has a lot of concentrated energy. Think of it as like a table with 3 legs. There's a missing piece. It's like you've got the apex planet, and then it's got all these squares going this way, and then it's missing the last link. And for Charlize, it was Saturn. And archetype that Saturn is thought of is the father figure. It's thought of as authority figures. It's thought of as your father. When you look at somebody's Saturn in their chart, it can have a lot to do with the father figure in their life. And in her case, her Saturn is so afflicted with T-squares. And then she has Venus retrograde square, natal Venus retrograde square, natal Neptune retrograde in a square. So it's just so fascinating to look at these themes in a person's chart and then look and see how it's played out over their lives. Jodie Foster has natal Venus retrograde in Scorpio. And, you know, one of the roles that Jodie Foster is very famous for is playing that agent in Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs is a very dark movie about a serial killer that goes around going after these women, and Jodie is the person in the movie that takes him down, and she does a lot of detective work. You know, Scorpio is ruled by the planet Pluto, and Pluto has a lot to do with like the underground, darker forces, just dark underworld stuff, you know, like that serial killer in Silence of the Lambs. And Jodie has natal Venus retrograde in Scorpio. So her Venus retrograde in Scorpio was shining in that role because she was perfect for the role. She's playing a detective agent that takes this guy down, and she's an investigator, and she's doing detective work, and she's being a badass woman who's doing a job that a lot of men usually do. And like I was saying, Venus retrograde is inverted gender roles. It can be inverted gender roles. It can be women who do jobs that men mostly do. And in this case, she was, you know, working in a male-dominated industry, and she was taking on that guy, Hannibal Lecter. And that movie, what's really fascinating about it from an astrological level is that that movie really affected her, because one of the people that saw the movie ended up stalking her and planned on killing her. And ironically, Silence of the Lambs was filmed during a Venus retrograde. A big portion of the movie was filmed during a Venus retrograde cycle. She has natal Venus retrograde, and she got stalked. So that's another dark side of Venus retrograde for people that have it, is they have to watch out when it comes to the energy that they attract to them, like Jodie. She was in the spotlight, she was shining creatively, she was in this groundbreaking movie that was a huge hit that people are still talking about, but she had a fan that got obsessed. Some of the dark parts of Scorpio is obsession, jealousy, possessiveness, over-fixating, kind of being black and white thinking that's polarized. So, you know, you've got to be careful with how you handle that. And in her case, she was in a pretty bad situation where she had to be escorted by armed guards, and she was really terrified about it. And from what I've researched, she really doesn't like talking about it. But it is interesting to look at Jodie's natal chart and see how her Venus retrograde in Scorpio has affected her creative life. So that's just one example of a woman who's got Venus retrograde and used it very constructively in a creative sense. She and Charlize Theron, they both really use that aspect in their chart, and they use it constructively into their art, which is being actresses. You know, they're channeling that energy and putting it into their roles that they're acting in. So that's very cool. As an astrologer, it's pretty interesting for me to sit back and look at that and notice the patterns. So that's just, you know, some people might ask me, why do I like looking at celebrities? Well, celebrities are interesting, but the main thing is that their life is public record. It's public knowledge. Like, everything about them's on there. So if I'm studying synodic astrology and planetary cycles and retrograde cycles, their lives are great tools for me because everything's documented and dated and there's times available. So I can look into all that and learn so much. That's a great way to learn astrology, is to look at that. Or just even look at your own life. Another person who's got Venus retrograde is Courtney Love, Kurt Cobain's wife. And her bandmate, and one of her bandmates, half of the women in the band whole had Venus retrograde. And you know, the title of that band is pretty suggestive to a female anatomy, and there you go. Venus retrograde musicians pushing the envelope about, you know, calling their band a kind of naughty, outrageous name. I mean, it's kind of fitting considering. And it's just interesting to see the patterns when you're studying astrology and Venus retrograde celebrities. Another Venus retrograde celebrity would be Charlie Chaplin and Eric Clapton. Very creative men, very creative musician, very creative producer and actor. What's interesting about them is their personal life and their relationships to women were very unusual, and their relationships to their mother. Their charts are actually very much alike. They're both Aries. They both have Scorpio moon in the first house in opposition to Venus retrograde in the 7th house. And, you know, Eric Clapton and Chaplin, they both had Venus retrograde in their 7th house of marriage and relationships. And they were both married numerous times, and a lot of things went down with secrecy and betrayals and affairs and, you know, having kids with other women while they were married to someone else, just different things like that. But at the same time, that's just the dark side of their Venus retrograde, was how they related to women and their relationship values being different from the norm of what society expects. But on the bright side, they had so much creativity and they made music like the song Layla. It's one of the best love songs in all of rock and roll history. Eric Clapton made that based on a situation that was very Venus retrograde themed. He was engaging in a love triangle with George Harrison's wife Patty Boyd and keeping it all a secret, and he made an entire album of music based on that situation. He channeled all that energy and he made an amazing album of love songs that people are still listening to. He made incredible music. All of that inspired him. So, like, you know, you see this with people with Venus retrograde. They're so creative, and, you know, instead of self-destructing, just use it for making creative projects. That's a beautiful way to use that energy in a constructive way. So yeah, you know, Venus retrograde, it has themes in our culture. It has its own themes and archetypal patterns. There's so much about Venus retrograde that's deeper and meets the eye more. You know, it's so fascinating, and I love talking about retrograde planet cycles. You know, but the bright side, the light side of Venus retrograde transit is the creativity. It's the emotional passion. It's the emotional power and intensity that these people can make art or music of all kinds. I mean, it's amazing. People with Venus retrograde are some of the most talented people out there. You know, they're amazing artists. So there is a light side to most transits. To all transits, there's a light and a dark side. I guess the main thing is how one decides how they want to use it. That's really how you don't have to let a transit define your life. You can learn about it, you can understand yourself more, and you can approach it in a way of learning and transcend past that. You can learn so much from it. And that's the beautiful thing about astrology, is that it's a tool for understanding yourself and other people more. And in order to understand other people better, you've got to understand yourself more. And understand, it can give you some answers. And it's a great tool. It's very healing. It's very illuminating. And yeah, so Venus retrograde, I've talked about a couple celebrities that have had it. I've explained what it does on an astronomical level. You know, another thing, you know, Venus retrograde natives, they do tend to have a propensity for having unusual, intense relationships with atypical value systems. That can happen, definitely. In some people with Venus retrograde, women, like Venus retrograde women, they have and possess a femininity that goes against their typical cultural norms and values. That can mean a variety of different things. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very good thing too. It just depends upon how they want to use it. Another thing about Venus retrograde I would like to talk about is how does Venus retrograde affect timing in people's lives and major events that happen to them? And it's very fascinating. Like, generally speaking, astrologers will say, you really shouldn't get married during a Venus retrograde, or, you know, be careful if you meet somebody during a Venus retrograde and you end up being in a relationship with them. Or they caution, or they say sometimes, oh, well, you met this person during Venus retrograde. We'll see how long that lasts. Generally speaking, from my own personal experience and what I've seen with people, I would have to say this is true. You really, I mean, in most cases, I don't think people with Venus retrograde, I really don't think people should get married during a Venus retrograde. However, that's speaking for people that don't natally have that in their chart. If someone has Venus retrograde natally, depending upon the aspects and the timing, and you look at the event, I mean, some people do get married during a Venus retrograde and they natally have it, and it works out well. Like, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, he has natal Venus retrograde, and he got married during the Venus retrograde of 2012, and that was a Venus retrograde that happened in Gemini. And he's still married, he's doing okay. I mean, sometimes it works for people, but in most cases, I really caution against getting married during a Venus retrograde, especially if it's your first marriage. You've been married a couple of times and you're older, you've already had your kids, and this is your second or third or fourth time around. That's a little bit different. But still, I don't recommend as an astrologer to get married during a Venus retrograde. Another thing about Venus retrograde, you might want to be cautious about buying a home during a Venus retrograde cycle. And if you do really have everything in a contract written down, so there's no loopholes or things that could financially disadvantage you. You know, Venus has a lot to do with finances, as it is naturally ruled by the second house. So any situations with money or contracts or buying a home, getting married, yeah, be careful. I mean, Venus retrograde also, it marks a time where there's a cyclical change. There's a new cycle. A lot of people get divorced during a Venus retrograde, or they uncover something that's going on in their relationship or their marriage during a Venus retrograde. And the Venus retrograde is kind of that time where the layers of a situation are being pulled off. It's a painful period, but you're learning things and it's affecting you and changing the course of your life. So Venus retrograde can manifest in that way as well. It can manifest as people getting divorced and going through money situations. They're tallying up their money, their possessions, they're fighting over what they're going to keep, or they're negotiating things in court during a divorce. A lot of times you see that happening, and sometimes it can be, if you're getting divorced during a Venus retrograde, that can be quite challenging because emotions can run higher at that time, and the energies can really affect the situation and it can add another layer of emotional intensity. Or some people discover that their partner's having an affair when there's a Venus retrograde. That can definitely happen. And you know, Venus retrograde doesn't always just affect a romantic relationship. Like, I'll use a personal example in my own life. So there was a Venus retrograde, in October and November of 2010, and that Venus retrograde was in Scorpio. Now, at that time, I was single. I wasn't dating anyone, but I was living with my best friend, and the long and short of it was I got in a horrible accident. I fell down the stairs, and my hand landed on a nail, and my hand was impaled by a nail. And you know, I was in shock. I freaked out, and I went back to the house, and I asked my best friend and roommate to drive me to the hospital, and she refused. She said she needed her sleep to go to work the next day. Well, I was very hurt. My feelings were very hurt, and I had to wrap my hand in a tourniquet, go to the emergency room, get a tetanus shot, get IVs put in, and get my hand glued back together because the puncture wound was so deep they couldn't stitch it. So the long and short of it was I was quite upset. I felt betrayed by my best friend. I felt like you weren't there for me when my hand was impaled. I had to drive myself to the hospital with one hand. So that I'm just telling this story as an example to indicate that Venus retrograde is not just about love relationships or romance. It can also influence friendships between two men or two women that are just platonic. It affected my relationship with my best friend deeply, and it was very painful. You do have to be cautious about people that you meet during a Venus retrograde, because later on you might notice there's different themes. And I've noticed with one friend of mine, anytime Venus goes retrograde, sometimes we end up having a falling out, or we have to take a break from our friendship because of events that occur. So now we both know when Venus goes retrograde, we might not want to go on a trip with each other, or we might want to be a little more careful with each other's emotions and our hearts and just be a little more mindful of that. So, you know, Venus retrograde, it's not necessarily just romantic. It can be issues between two friends. It could be a betrayal between two friends. It could be issues with your family members. It really just depends on the situation. It's not always the same. Not every retrograde is the same. Some Venus retrogrades, they hit people harder than others. You might hear about people that are suffering a lot and really going through a lot, and then other people who are doing great. You know, it really depends upon their charts. I'll take a friend of mine, for example. She and her husband got married around a Venus retrograde, but they were almost 40 years old, and they'd known each other for 15 years before getting married, and it was an old love. It was older love. It wasn't something new. So for them, it was great. Like, Venus retrograde is great for old relationships, or bringing old lovers back into your life, or old exes can come out of the woodwork. During a Venus retrograde, you might hear from somebody you hadn't heard from for a long time. The Venus retrograde is not necessarily a great period for forming new relationships. However, it can be great for rehashing over old relationships that have unfinished business. The Venus retrograde basically influences old situations that need to be settled. That can come out of the woodwork. Whatever needs to be processed or handled will come out of the woodwork. Whether it's old exes, old friends, people from your past you haven't heard from for a long time, or even if it's old emotions that you have had suppressed, that you haven't processed. Some people get very emotional during Venus retrogrades, or maybe they have certain kinds of dreams. You know, maybe Venus retrogrades transiting through their 12th house. The 12th house is about unconscious. It's about your dream state. It's naturally ruled by Pisces. So it just depends. I mean, Venus retrograde does not affect everybody in the same way. It really can vary, and it can happen in numerous different ways. And the best way to really understand how Venus retrograde is going to affect you is to really look over your life. Look at your journals, think back on the most important things that have happened, major events, emotional situations, big changes. Just look at them, look at the dates, get an ephemeris, look up the date, and see if you see anything in there. You never know. I mean, that's how you learn. And like I said, the easiest way to really calculate a Venus retrograde is you subtract 8 years. For example, the last time that we had Venus retrograde in Leo Virgo was July and August of, no, it was July 2015 through no, it was July 25th, 2015 through September 5th. That was the Leo Virgo Venus retrograde. And then before 2000, the last Leo Virgo retrograde, let's see, it was 2007, summer of 2007, summer of 1999, and 1991. So 91, 99, 2007, and 2015 were the last most recent Venus retrogrades, and it happens every 8 years. So if we just had a Venus retrograde in Aries in 2017, you would subtract 8 years from that, and that would mean that the last Venus retrograde we had was in spring of 2009, and then before that 2001, and then 1993, and 1985, and 1977. And you know, I can rattle off these dates because I've been studying SYNODIC astrology for almost 10 years now. I've memorized all the timetables of all the dates and the planetary cycles, and it's really easy to do. It's every 8 years, each sign. You just subtract 8 years. But if you're just a beginner and you're trying to understand Venus retrograde cycles, the best way to learn is to get an ephemeris, pull out your journals, do some self-reflection, or even just talk to your friends or people that are close to you in your life and ask them questions and see if there's a pattern that happens for them. You know, you just got to get the two ephemerises for the 20th century and the 21st century, and then you're good to go. That is one of the best tools you can use for understanding the Venus retrograde. It can be a little dangerous to start relationships during the Venus retrograde, as I was saying, like I've noticed with several people. They may have started, you know, what can sometimes happen is you start a relationship under Venus retrograde and the person ends up being kind of difficult or abusive, or it just becomes a very destructive relationship. But it's very passionate at first, but then it can change and shift. Another thing that's dangerous about getting married during a Venus retrograde is oftentimes you end up getting divorced under one. And remember, Venus retrogrades every 8 years in each sign. Like I'll take one client for example. She got married. She married a man who she'd known since she was really young, like 12. They met when they were 12 years old. They dated for decades. They got married under a Venus retrograde. They got married in, let's see, I'm trying to remember. They got divorced in 2012, and then let's see, and then I think they were married 8 years before, and they got married under the Venus retrograde in Gemini, and then they got divorced under the Venus retrograde in Gemini. So it took like a Venus cycle. Their marriage only lasted a Venus cycle, which is 8 years in that sign. And she couldn't believe that I asked her, oh, did you happen to get divorced in May of 2012? And she's like, yeah, how did you know? And it's like, it's not that I guessed it, I just know because I understand planet cycles and how they work and how they affect relationships. And, you know, when you're talking to somebody about their marriage or planning a wedding or a major event, you really want to avoid doing it during a Venus retrograde, if it's especially a theme like that, like marriage. You know, like the other thing, like I could rattle off some different dates for retrogrades. The Venus retrograde in Gemini, the last one was in 2012. The next one's going to be in 2020. And then the one after that is going to be in 2028. And then there was one in 2004, 1998. Wait, no, it was 2004 and 1996. So you look in the ephemeris and you subtract 8 years, and that's how you're going to learn how to understand the retrogrades. And then before you know it, you'll be looking at your chart and your transits, or talking to someone else, and you'll know how to figure those planet cycles out. And it's very interesting. No doubt about it. I mean, only 7 to 8% of people have Venus retrograde. It's not the most common transit for people to have. A fair amount of people have it, but you don't see it all the time. It's so fascinating to study people who have Venus retrograde. They definitely have very interesting lives. Intense, passionate. It has, you know, they will encounter difficulty. It's not an easy transit to have. I guess, you know, synodic cycles and synodic astrology is very fascinating. Basically, what is synodic astrology? Synodic astrology is, in general terms, it is defined as being the exploration of planetary cycles. So it's an aspect of astrology where you're really studying the cycles of the planet. You're studying the retrograde cycles of Mercury, Mars, Venus, Neptune, Saturn. I mean, you could study all the retrograde cycles. It's very fascinating. And it's really a great tool and a key for understanding patterns and links in a person's life. And it's a great tool to learn, because then you can build that up for practicing predictive astrology. Or even if you're not an astrologer and you want to understand things better and periods of time better, this is a great way to start understanding the Venus retrograde. And like I was saying, the Venus retrograde is so much more than just, you know, about romantic relationships. It encompasses so much. It can be a lot about the inner work that you do within yourself as a person. It's a very deep transit. It can really affect your relationships, your jobs, your finance, how you relate to your friends, family, loved ones. It can also be a lot with how you, it can have a lot of influence on how you process your emotions too, and your creativity. So Venus retrogrades are a very defined cycle. It runs like clockwork. It's very precise. So it's not that hard to learn how to do it. And I love talking about Venus retrograde and famous people that have it. And what I'm going to do, since this is just an introduction video to Venus retrograde and understanding it better, what I would like to do is make a part 2 video where I talk about the actual aspects of Venus retrograde in different celebrities' charts. You can actually really go and digress it and see the patterns of it repeating itself, those retrograde cycles repeating itself and major events. Another thing that can be very interesting to do with Venus retrograde is you can see how Venus retrograde has affected history, major historical events. You can look at that and see. So that, you know, I am planning on doing a part 2 for the Venus retrograde video. And I thank you all for watching my video. It was an honor to talk about this, and I hope that you learned something from my video. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.